First, let me thank you all for coming. I, as I will explain shortly, this gathering may be a first of kind, and of course that means undoubtedly it can and will be improved upon if, with any luck. Uh, the idea that a operation like my own, which is focused on the spread of mostly nuclear, but also missile weaponry, should focus on this topic is not immediately clear what the connection might be. But let's just say, uh, I think, with any luck, uh, the emphasis and reliance on weapons that can quickly, literally decimate large amounts of military and industrial capital, which has been a favorite theme now for about a century. The air war theories in the 1920s were, I think, the first to really spell out the desirability of this model of warfare. That that idea is beginning to be, uh, I don't know whether the word supplanted is quite right, but certainly complemented at minimum by something that is called new generation warfare. Now, that literature is rife with sophistication that's so extreme, I'm not sure I understand it all. But roughly, this new theory of warfare uh, promises to disable enemies without decimating their industrial and military capital necessarily, but disabling it nonetheless. And it may spare the devastation of city centers and therefore large numbers of innocents being killed. That isn't to say innocents won't be killed, just the dimensions of the numbers would be a lot less. So anything that might promise that is something that's of interest to my organization, which is always interested in thinking about how reliance on nuclear weapons for strategic deterrence might be reduced or pushed a little bit further into the background. All right, so that's by way of apology, why this organization would join with Hudson to have something about cyber. I can tell you that what I know about cyber is perhaps the smallest component of my comprehension of things military that I have. That has never deterred me from dipping into a topic, though. About 5 years ago, or actually a little longer, I decided that another area that might promise to move our attention away from destroying cities and industrial centers with nuclear weapons to win or deter wars was understanding space operations, which roughly weren't arms, and they weren't the legs that delivered the arms, but they were the brain. Sort of, if you could disable or protect the brain, you could fight. But if you couldn't, it didn't matter what your numbers were. I got into that, and I was told right away it would be a dead end because everything was classified. Yeah, and you couldn't get people to risk their clearance to come and talk. And if you did get them to come and talk, they would be very fractious. They would try to shut other people up from saying things, and you wouldn't get anything of value. Well, because I was told that, I insisted on going ahead. And it turned out all those predictions were absolutely wrong. I mean, just totally wrong. In ways, I could spend another 20 minutes talking about. I am hoping that my hunch about cyber will be as right as all of the conventional people I've talked with tell me I'm wrong in the same way. And what I mean by that is I was told everything's classified, no one can talk about it. You won't get anyone to do anything of interest. I'm hoping that's wrong. And the reason why I'm hoping that's wrong is uh, I think as we as a country work with our allies, as many of which we have friends here today from the countries, you know, South Korea, Japan, Australia, uh, and Europe, even if they're not here, they're certainly our friends. Uh, as we deal with Russia and China in particular, I suspect, much like the beginning and ultimately the end of the Second World War, uh, it won't be just by having a lot of arms that we're going to be able to protect ourselves against the worst. That competition, even in the fighting war in the Second World War, had a lot to do with what was called the Wizard War. And that had to do with cracking codes, you know, ultra, developing things like radar, and applying methodologies that just weren't ever used before, like operations research. Uh, so, if that's at all correct, we need to do very well at this because it could be that our ability to quantitatively compete making weapons against both Russia and China might be a very tall order. And that might be the most difficult way to prevail. All right. Uh, I suppose the last comment would be um, why this meeting tonight is, I think, quite unusual. I think you may remember this. I'd like to think several years from now, having come to this meeting, and that's because I have looked high and low, and only been able to learn about meetings that are on China's offensive cyber strategy. There's lots of them. I mean, you know, you can go to various places, and they even will give you free food. There are just lots of meetings, and what to do about their offensive cyber strategy. I could not, for the life of me, however, find anything on what our offensive cyber strategy might be against China. There's something odd about that. Now, some people have told me that the reason it is that way is because it's highly classified. And my rejoinder to that is, well, maybe that's a mistake now. And the reason why is generally, if you do not have a public policy, it's very difficult to have secret operations that make sense. And so you can't just have secret operations unhinged from some public articulation of what you're doing. There are also maybe tactical reasons why this would make sense to start talking. You know, in the operations that we've had, that we've seen against the Russians in Ukraine, a very important aspect of it has to do with cyber. And while we certainly, uh, you know, have uh, helped the Ukrainians uh, from government efforts, some of the most interesting and important work right now is being done by people not associated with either, well, any allied government or even the Ukraine. They're private people. They probably need to know something about what the objectives might be if there is a need for their services. And I think you'd have to talk to them in the open. With that as a curtain raiser, um, we're really fortunate tonight to have two people who know a great deal about these things. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, what's the connection to AUKUS? Because after all, this is a series on AUKUS and PAC specifically, you know, how to strengthen our technical collaborations on defense-related matters in the Pacific. And I think the simple answer is, well, there's a component in AUKUS dealing with cyber. So that's one answer. And the other is there ought to be some discussion, and there ought to be more. And maybe it shouldn't just be restricted to working with Australia. Japan, South Korea, at a minimum, seem to be pretty important players as well. So I've done a long apologia. And how many are with us now, Bailey?
22. I think we should get started.
Yes, exactly. I think I've spun and done the drum roll long enough. We're going to hear a thesis, you know, which is quite controversial, but I think it, by being controversial, it at least get us thinking. I mean, yours is, our project tonight isn't necessarily to agree about what to do, but whether or not we need to think about doing things. And I think the presentation we're going to get will at least do that. I can assure you that. And I think it comes from someone who has served not only in combat zones where there's live fire, which defines in my book physical courage, but and that's Afghanistan, but also in Japan, and is someone who is quite accomplished dealing with cyber, and in fact is responsible for instruction in these matters down in Florida. I believe you should tell me, Jake, are you taking a special a position either in the government or temporarily out of it? What is your current next move?
So I'll be going through a normal PCS rotation. My tour is up at my current duty station at Information Warfare Training Command in Corey Station, Pensacola, Florida, where I'm the executive officer, and I'll be heading down to U.S. Special Operations Command headquartered in Tampa, where I'll be working with the J3 in the operations department.
Okay, this gives you, just listening to those words should tell everyone we have someone who's actually working the serious end of these topics. You know, this is not an academic we're talking about, even though he has a PhD. All right. We also are lucky to have one of the leading experts on cyber matters from Australia, Fergus Hansen. And I think we could do no better than to listen to each one of these people, first make an argument and comment on the argument. And I think after that, we'll open it up to discussion. So, Jake, why don't you go through your PowerPoints?
Okay. Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I think you asked me to keep everything to like 15, 20 minutes or so. So I'll run through these pretty quickly. But if you want to go back and review on the PowerPoint in the notes section, I've kind of written out a narrative, and as well as there's a handout that goes into more detail on some of these issues. So I'll just go ahead and keep it brief because I know you've got the backup notes and you can look back later at your pleasure. Okay, so let me foot stomp this right here, right now. I do not represent the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, any entity within the U.S. government. I am talking to you today as citizen of the United States. However, feedback is always welcome. There's my email address. Please don't hesitate to ever reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about these things further at all. Happy to help anytime, day or night. Okay, there's a little bit about me. We'll just skip over that, but that gives you a little bit about what I've been doing. So let's talk first real quick about some reality checks. First and foremost, when you start talking about a competition or conflict between the United States and the PRC, there will be no economic or technological advantage. You will not have that in this case. China is a peer. We need to just cut out with the whole near peer stuff and, you know, generational leaps. We're not going to have that right now. Quite frankly, defense planning overall within the department, it remains mired in traditional 20th century ways of thinking. You know, the idea that we're going to configure conventional forces to either deter war or prevail should it occur. We're not even dealing in the cyber and information space as a tool from which to prevent, deter, or prevail in war at all, in my opinion. Now, China has proven that they are able to employ information technology. They use an algorithmic decision-making process to impose information controls within China and generate mass disruptive effects on populations outside of China. This has fundamentally altered the global balance of power. They have been able to do this without going to war. Now, that does not mean that they are not investing massive amounts of resources into war-fighting capabilities. They absolutely are, and they intend to use those capabilities, in my opinion, in the very near future. But right now, they have achieved what they have in large part by through the use of cyber-enabled technology. Our cyber planning, in my opinion, it clings to legacy approaches toward military targeting. It's a very 20th century mindset. It makes assumptions that via cyberspace we can hold targets at risk. We can action them at a time and place of our choosing. Again, in my opinion, that totally misunderstands what cyberspace is and what you can achieve with it. There is no such thing as deterrence in cyberspace. There's no such thing as holding a target at risk or actioning it at a time and place of our choosing, as if there's a button somewhere deep in the bowels of the Pentagon where I could just walk up, pick a city around the world and hit a button, and via cyber means all the power goes out. That's not how cyber works. That's not how it's ever worked. And clinging to those kinds of approaches are just going to get us into more and more problems. They make, in my opinion, conflict with China becomes more likely because of the way we approach cyber. So, again, when we talk about China, we tend to kind of get into a lot of navel gazing and, oh my goodness, it's, you know, look at how big they are. They have 1 out of every 7 human beings on the planet is Chinese. Now, that is a fact. Their GDP is, you know, whether depending on how you want to count it, 13 trillion, 22 trillion, I don't know. You know, they're either 16% or 25% of global gross domestic product. They're either bigger or smaller than the United States. But they're certainly not 10 feet tall. They face significant economic, demographic, and operational challenges even to this day. They still depend on Western technology. They require access to global markets, foreign direct investment, foreign manufacturing. They have to import critical resources, including fundamentally fuel and food. Their security of their critical infrastructure and their financial markets are really actually quite fragile. So they have a lot of big challenges, and I think they understand this.
You're breaking news to me.
Information control. So the Chinese have erected, you know, whether you want to call it the bamboo curtain or anything like that, but those information control systems via cyberspace through censorship and monitoring of its population, both within China and outside of China. Well, by that very definition of what information control is, it requires that information technology contain backdoors. That means that information assurance cannot be attained because all of your security services in China have to be able to monitor you. Well, that requires that all of the technology that's built, sold, and all over China actually is not secure by definition. This is a huge vulnerability. We should be exploiting this. And we'll go through, I'll talk about a little bit about how some ways in which you might do that. Of course, finally, their entire system rests on just a hyper nationalism, a sense of acute paranoia, and that cannot be overemphasized. And through cyber-enabled means, we should be able to, exacerbate those paranoias, those hyper nationalisms, that create mass social and psychological effects that can really create fundamental problems for the CCP. And that's really the ultimate target here on all of this is the CCP. So, really, at the end of the day, no matter what strategy we talk about, you'll hear deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment, integrated deterrence, whatever that is. Any strategy that does not fundamentally alter China's trajectory, and by that I mean its economic, civil, military fusion, its power, its ability to project power, if we don't alter that trajectory, our strategy will fail. They will achieve their goals. We have to attack what the CCP values most, and that is their political legitimacy and their system controls. That requires something we used to be very, very good at: political warfare, economic warfare, and cyber-enabled means are just a really low-cost, high-reward way to do that. We can force the CCP to shift resources away from power projection and back toward internal controls. We can inhibit and disrupt all of their civil military fusion programs. The cyber-enabled campaigns represent the best option to do that. It's the most cost-effective. It's the most, I don't want to say clandestine, but it's the hardest to actually measure and detect. And there's a lot of ways that we can achieve a lot of our goals without having to be overt as continuing to send DD destroyers up and down the Taiwan Strait, for example. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. We absolutely should. And, I'm not saying we should sacrifice conventional or nuclear forces for a cyber option. What I'm saying is, if we're not doing something like this, using our information-related capabilities, we will continue to fall short, and we will risk the very war that we hope to avoid. So what sort of campaign can we talk about here? Well, I've kind of drawn 4 lines of effort to achieve 2 fundamental objectives. Those fundamental objectives I talked about earlier were, attacking their political legitimacy and their system controls. The first and foremost, on the economic side, attempting to undercut the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road Initiative, their global economic development campaign, which includes a lot of information technology infrastructure, telecommunications, all of that, it presents a huge attack surface that cyber-enabled means can exploit. They're financial institutions. And as I kind of lay out in that handout, we can encourage them via information means to make poor investment choices, or to shift resources from one thing to another, or to create friction within the financial system. Slow those drivers of economic growth, which are principally large capital investment and worker productivity. If we can create lost work hours in the system, reducing the quality of critical imports, like I said, they require so much still. And we have via cyber ways, we could probably be reducing the quality of those critical imports such as they don't work as well. Or certainly do not allow them to achieve what it is they're trying to achieve. Thinking specifically about science and technology, that entire civil military fusion research and development is being conducted. I think there's around 120 research institutes are in and around China that are vulnerable to cyber exploitation. Going in and being able to exploit those networks and to disrupt or steer their research and development into areas that benefit or where we can leverage our comparative advantages over them. Leveraging neuroscience. There's a lot of new neuroscience helps us understand how and why the brain works, and being able to nudge behavior in a way through the use of influencers, through the use of attention-based economic models, such as online gaming, social media campaigns, those kinds of things, to try and get the people, the vast bulk of people, interested in other things. And I don't necessarily need, and I'm not talking about making them all into little pro-American Democrats at all. I'm talking about getting them to be more concerned about their online gaming accounts, or to be and you can see it recently where the Chinese Communist Party started instituting controls on screen time for young people. So they clearly understand what's happening when you have entire generations that are just glued to a screen, either on TikTok or on social media or on playing online games, those kinds of things. That represents a huge way in which we can try and introduce friction and nudge behavior overall in the population. Penetrating and exploiting those research universities, again, they're open, public facing, they're easier to get into, and why we're not leveraging that is something that I always am shocked and amazed by. Again, it's all about political right, political legitimacy. So how do we go after their political legitimacy as well as around the globe? Well, cyber-enabled means are one way in which we can help elevate those global antibodies. The fact that China is coming into countries and offering investment, and basically it's nothing more than a neo-mercantilist model where they strip out all of the resources and send everything back to China. They import Chinese labor into these foreign countries. They don't use locals, nationals, and so how do we elevate those global antibodies? Well, conducting clandestine or non-attributable social media campaigns highlighting political corruption. So, for example, think about the Solomon Islands recently. That was a clear, I will bet a good portion of my month's pay that the whole security agreement that was worked out between Beijing and the Solomon Islands had nothing to do with climate change. It had everything to do with bags of money, basically. They were the ruling government was bought off, and that's how China is known to do business, especially in the developing world. The Google effect, for example, conducting influence campaigns within global corporate shareholders and employees to create internal friction and opposition to doing business with China or jointly with Chinese companies. I mean, if you think about how the employees of Google, when they found out about Project Maven and how the Department of Defense and Google were working together on developing artificial intelligence means by which to conduct targeting. Actually, it was conducting targeting to limit civilian casualties, but never mind that. They were working with the Department of Defense. The employees rose up in protest, and Google actually pulled out of working with the Pentagon. Well, we can create those same kinds of effects in other large corporations for working with China. Exploiting local CCP cadres, those local cadres in China and all around the world, because every Chinese company around the world is required by law to have a local communist Chinese cell to promote Xi Jinping thought within the company. Those are all easily exploitable. And again, creating friction within the party forces the party to begin to question its security and control over the population. The big fish, and here, if you think about Jack Ma, the CCP has a deep concern over those who might become a threat to Xi Jinping. We can exploit networks associated with others to exacerbate fears within the CCP of alternative power centers being developed, questioning their loyalty. So those big fish, though, are the principal drivers of China's economy. So as I keep creating friction between the big fish, the big investors, the Jack Ma's, and the Chinese Communist Party, pretty soon you're going to have more friction in the whole economic information space. A parallel effort might highlight corruption and wealth disparities within China, especially on social media platforms. And this would help suggest, for example, that the CCP is not concerned about the poor or the middle class, and especially if you want to talk about not only wealth disparities, but environmental degradation, growing expenditures on the military, especially as you have a massive aging population, that there is no social safety net. And so every time you build an aircraft carrier, what you're saying is Granny doesn't get to go to a nursing home, and who's going to take care of Granny now? So there's a lot of elements of friction we can introduce in that. Finally, influence and information control. Penetrating the United Front. If you don't know what the United Front is, the United Front Workers Department, that is basically their outward facing organization that spreads globally and works to co-opt, especially elites in other countries. Think of Confucius Institutes and other means by which they're able to place communist Chinese assets in major foreign companies and in government and in critical organizations, lobbyists, for example. But penetrating and illuminating United Front penetration and influence over foreign countries and foreign corporations, institutions, steer United Front efforts to penetrate institutions that actually support our own deception plans and our own denial plans. Another way we can do that is through a program called lying eyes. Lying eyes, I mean by that, most, like I said earlier, the Chinese information control system, by its very design, has to create backdoors, right? Well, most Chinese surveillance camera systems, Hikvision, easily penetratable, easily. They lack basic securities. So imagine what you could do if you could begin to make the Chinese Communist Party see what I want you to see. And then therefore what you see is eventually what you think. And if I can get you to and piggybacking on that, the social credit system, if I can make the loyal appear disloyal and vice versa through manipulation of their social credit system. Another example is what I call blowback mountain. Using information capabilities, manipulating surveillance, monitoring the behavioral systems against the Chinese people by exploiting fissures between consumers and Chinese companies, security services, and the party apparatus. Accelerate the process of Chinese netizens, for example, finding and exposing information that is within the Chinese system that is hidden. So it's not the United States or Australia or Japan or somebody else exposing the Chinese, because the Chinese will automatically dismiss that. But if it's exposed by netizens in China, well, then you create real friction in the system, and you create constant worry and headache within the party on their political legitimacy and ability to control the system. Now, these are just a few of the things that we can do via cyberspace to achieve our two ultimate objectives, and that is, attack their political legitimacy and attack their system controls. What does this require to do? Well, first and foremost, you need metrics to evaluate the progress, and I list, I suggest, instead of talking about GDP or things like that, there are other things that we can look at to determine whether or not our cyber-enabled campaigns are actually able to do or are achieving what it is we need to. Looking at personal income, aggregate debt, factory productivity, unemployment. Related to that, though, we, the United States, our friends, partners, and allies, we need a way to evaluate and assess strategic latency and disruption, and especially the emergence of disruptive technologies. That is something that we are, I think, woefully within the national security establishment of the government. We really don't track that at all, and that's critical to these campaigns. We need in essence, what we're talking about is a cognitive warfighting entity charged with that is directing and executing these campaigns. That the ability to monitor and evaluate the sources of U.S. and allied power, identify areas of potential comparative advantage for investment, to be able to conduct ISR of the cognitive warfighting space, to prepare and execute cognitive and counter-cognitive campaigns, to evaluate, exercise, and inform and harden U.S. and allied decision processes at the federal, state, and local level, to evaluate and exploit foreign decision processes, to be able to conduct coordinated influence campaigns, both within friendly space and as well as the hostile space. And finally, developing and monitoring friendly foreign decision-making processes so that we all understand where we are in executing these kinds of campaigns. And that's something I think we don't truly appreciate. Now, I'll list some of these concerns. These concerns, I know, usually will get pointed out, and I have a little response in the handout. But obviously, what hurts China hurts the rest of the world, right? And so any campaign that seeks to undermine or reduce China's growth is going to hurt the rest of us. Attacking their growth harms the Chinese people. It invites retaliation or escalation. And it may push the CCP to be more aggressive. Well, first of all, dealing with the first point, yes, this is painful. This is all going to be painful. But folks, look at what's going on with COVID in the supply chain process right now. I would humbly suggest to you that China's response to COVID and the supply chain issues around the world and their ability to leverage the economic dependence of the globe on China just shows you what they intend. So yes, they're going through a lot of pain right now, but they intend to export that pain around the world. There are hundreds of cargo container ships sitting off the coast of Shanghai right now. Shanghai's locked down because of COVID. Those cargo ships are not, able to unload and offload cargo that's meant for distribution around the world. That is a feature, not a bug, of China's COVID policy. They are leveraging COVID in order to create systemic economic shocks globally in order to continue to harm and hamper global economic growth. So what hurts China hurts the US? Yes, that's true. Is it going to be painful? Yes. Is it going to be as painful as losing a war to China? No. So keep that in mind. Attacking their economic growth harms the Chinese people. Folks, there is nothing we can do that harms the Chinese people more than the Communist Chinese Party. Whatever decisions the CCP makes, that's on them. That's not on us. Does it invite retaliation and escalation? I've yet to see where any other option has altered Chinese behavior. No other option has altered their behavior, changed their risk calculus. They continue to escalate in cyberspace and actually globally in the conventional world. They're the ones who are getting more aggressive at this point. So you've just got to bake that into your assessment of Chinese behavior, specifically Xi Jinping's risk calculus in all of this. He's going to be more aggressive. They're going to be more aggressive because I think they understand also their window of strategic opportunity is beginning to close. They understand the economic and demographic headwinds that they face. They see that the world is kind of waking up to what it is they're doing. And even though we may not have a good coordinated response yet, they know that they need to start locking in gains now. Otherwise, they may never get them back. So that's kind of and they have a more detailed rejoinder into all of these concerns and objectives. And finally, this sometimes makes me chuckle when some of my friends in the Department of Defense say, we don't do economic warfare. Just like, what do you think a blockade is? What do you think a strategic aerial bombing campaign is? We do all warfare fundamentally is about trying to eliminate the adversary's ability to make war on you. And that ultimately involves attacking their economic infrastructure. So when my colleagues and folks say that we don't do economic warfare, I'm like, you need to go back and understand history. That the only wars are won ultimately about the one side's ability to outproduce the other. And in this case, if we don't start changing the trajectory of China, we will always be behind. And even when combined with our friends, partners, and allies, we will always be behind. Okay, some final thoughts here, and then I'll turn it over to Ferguson. Hey, yeah, nobody's going to like this, as I say in there. There's significant antibodies within the national security ecosystem enterprise. I get it. You know, it's the words integrated deterrence don't really fit in here. So maybe that's part of the problem. While there is an emerging bipartisan consensus, I think that China is the significant challenge for the United States and the rest of the world. There is no articulated end state. There is no theory of victory other than perpetual competition. And I don't think the American taxpayer, to speak as an American, I don't think the American taxpayer is going to be comfortable cutting roughly $1 trillion check every year in perpetuity just to maintain a permanent state of competition between the United States and China, unless somebody starts articulating an end state, a theory of victory, a vision. Tell me how this ends. That's not being talked about. Cyber-enabled campaigns, I believe, can have a disproportionate strategic effect, especially when compared to their cost. And I'm not saying we shift money away from other things, but we do need to pay for these types of campaigns and start conducting them in a coordinated sense. These campaigns require persistence and time, though. We have to act now. Our window, we are well within the envelope of strategic surprise. And the lack of a true sense of urgency, and by that I mean people who know and understand that we are behind, and that if we don't deal with this by 2026, we are going to be in a position to where we are going to lose. And losing a war to China will carry with it a burden that I don't think we actually can comprehend right now. We have to act now. And looking at the last couple of budget proposals, I don't see that we're serious about acting right now when it comes to our conventional deterrent, our conventional means. Then I would offer this up as an alternative then. Far less expensive. You can keep buying your conventional things and nuclear forces that need modernization, but this is something that requires persistence, times, and a coordinated action, but it needs to get started now. Okay, that is me. I think I kept it. I keep you at 20 minutes or less, I hope. I'll go ahead and turn things over to Ferguson to tell me where I'm wrong. I do want to give a particular shout out to Dr. Emily Goldman. I had the pleasure of working for Emily when I was stationed at US Cybercom a few years ago. So I had to learn cyber from somebody. I learned it from Emily. So anything I ever get right is always due to her kindness, and she took me under her wing and tried to help me along. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff doesn't stick under here. I'm just a dumb sailor, but you know, thank you so much. I do always want to thank Emily whenever I have a chance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ferguson and stand by for questions. And if you want me to stop sharing my screen, let me know. I can do that.
Why don't you take your screen down, and we'll turn to Fergus, who may have, you know, a different take. He's, if you've looked at his bio, for me, it's a source of immense envy. I mean, I'm trying to imagine all of the things that are there, including he's on the board of directors of Art Monthly. And I mean, my wife paints, so I'm curious to learn more about that. And it is a description of what looks to be an incredibly humane set of pursuits. And I say that smiling because I wish we all would shoot as high as Mr. Hansen has. And in that regard, I am really looking forward to his comments. First.
Thanks, Henry. That's really kind of you. And thanks for having me along. It was, Jake, thank you for the presentation. I think there's an enormous amount there, and I work at a think tank, so I love having a truly thought-provoking discussion. I think you've hit the mark there with a bunch of really interesting different approaches to the ones we're taking at the moment. So I wanted to provide just some opening remarks. I've seen some questions that come through, so I will be quick so we can get to them as well. The first reflection I had on this was, I think we need, as you sort of hinted at, these very same tactics are being used by our adversaries to achieve effects already. So we probably need to be thinking about this type of approach in that context. If you look at the study from the US Trade Representative, there was an estimate around 250 billion to 600 billion annually being stolen of American IP being stolen. A lot of it through cyber means. So that's a huge transfer, effectively a transfer of wealth over time from one country to another. There's other areas where we're seeing this, so talent recruitment stations that have been set up around the world to siphon off IP from around the globe. One of the interesting pieces of work that the team has done in my center is around a company called GTCom, which is a wholly owned company of the Chinese propaganda department that makes natural language processing software that's embedded in everyday consumer devices as a sort of listening tool that's being baked into consumer products. So we haven't really started to think about this in terms of how it's being used against us. So I wanted to just sort of frame my comments in that sort of context. How we think about cyber operations, I think, is a really interesting point you raised. It does seem to be something that we think of as a tool that supplements military operations, that we can use it to either achieve military effects through a different means. And you have examples like, the Stuxnet campaign in Iran as a means of slowing down the Iranian government's nuclear program. We had Russia's effort a while back now to shut down the Ukrainian power supply. Both of those activities could have been achieved through a traditional military operation. But I think what you talked about is taking a much broader look at how you could apply cyber differently and outside of a military construct. And that sort of brings me to the second point I was going to make, which was around the institutional structures that we've got at the moment. I think there's, at least here in Australia, and I think in the US as well, there's setting aside whether governments want to do this or not, there's a question of whether our architecture is right. Most countries' cyber capability sits within military-related agencies or agencies that are close to the military. But I think where this type of activity would not neatly sit there, and there'd need to be some close alignment with agencies that traditionally don't play a lot in this space, like foreign affairs departments, to make sure we didn't accidentally start a conflict with these types of approaches. So I think it's a different way institutionally of thinking about cyber. I think it also challenges our view of cyber. Normally we think of offensive cyber as having, and I think you talked about this, a moment in time effect that you press a button, you shut down the power grid, and we spend a long time building the pathways into whatever piece of wherever we're trying to have an effect and developing the exploit, and it's ready to go, but it has a point in time impact, and that effect often is not a very lasting one. What we're talking about, I think the example of Russia, in Russia's case, they shut down the power plant for 6 hours or something like that. In this context, what you're talking about is a long drawn out campaign that could take decades. and brings in a lot of different arms of state. So I think it's a sort of different conceptual view of how we deal with cyber. I wanted to offer some caution. So I think, with some of the things like disrupting quality of inputs and supply chain disruption, one of my areas that I worked in a previous life was around modern slavery and forced labor in supply chains. And often you talk to companies that would have, supply chains 10 or 11 deep. It was really hard for them, even when they had an operational imperative to understand their supply chains for, the quality of the products that were going into things like oil rigs. It was really difficult for them to dig down 10, 11 deep into their supply chain. So if you're disrupting the supply chain of a country that feeds so voraciously into global supply chains, I think that could have a potential to backfire on us. The other piece of this, I think, that is a cautionary tale to us and a note of warning is a lot of these, several of these ideas you put forward also are vulnerabilities for us. If you're talking about, undermining the integrity of, bank financial systems, supply chains, that could all be equally done to us as well. So I think we need to be thinking about the defensive piece of this as well, particularly because we've seen weaponization of different aspects of what some of the things you've been talking about already. So I think we've got to be thinking both the defense piece, if at the same time you'd be talking about ideas like this. I also wanted to sort of test, talk about some of the different approaches that you could take. So this is obviously quite an assertive approach, quite a hard approach to that you've put forward. Another one I think that is, pretty effective is a sort of a softer approach, but I think can be equally effective and really problematic for the regime for different things, different reasons that you've outlined. Most importantly, the party's primary objective, which is to maintain power, and that is sort of shining a light on things. And an example, we had here was a piece of work we did around the Xinjiang Data Project, which was really about providing irrefutable evidence about the human rights abuses that were being conducted in Xinjiang, or there's others that are, shining a light on corruption from party officials and things like that. There's huge blowback in terms of the party's anger at that type of data that comes out that shines that kind of light on things. But I think that's a sign that it's also quite effective in terms of pushing them into uncomfortable territory that isn't which is potentially able to push them in different directions. The other piece I just wanted to two other sort of overarching thoughts, and I'll drop out was the values. I think we have to place this in. We're really talking about the crux of this is a competition based around values. There's a democratic world and there's an authoritarian world, and they're offering very different models. And at the heart of that difference is values. So I think we need to anchor any campaign in values that align with our democratic principles and and human rights and what it is that we fundamentally stand for and why that's different from an authoritarian state. And I think whatever we sort of, if people are going to pursue this kind of approach, we really need to anchor it in that values piece to start with. I'll leave it there, Henry. I've got other things I could say coming up, but thank you very much for the chance to provide some feedback. And thanks.
Well, that was, I think both presentations are extremely useful. What I'd like to do, people are queuing up in the comment room, and what I'd like to do is first turn to one individual who I actually asked to reflect on these materials, Eric Brown, but then open it up, and then see. We may run a little over because the subscription rate's quite high still, and we've got some people from across the globe here. We'll see how that plays out. I just wanted to at least comment and say an immense thank you to Brian Clark, my co-conspirator, because he's the one that identified Jake Beaver to begin with, and without him, we wouldn't have as much to talk about by a wide margin. So I just want, Brian is there in the background, but he really is the genius of this meeting in some fundamental way. Eric, you had some thoughts that you shared earlier at other meetings that might be pick up on Fergus's comment about values. And why don't you make your comments, and then we'll go through the regular order. If you have a desire to speak, the best way to raise your hand is to just indicate in the chat room. Otherwise, if that's just too difficult, right, and you find raising your hand easier, I will try to pay attention to that as well. Eric?
Right. Thank you. I'm not sure I have much to add to these two very rich presentations, but I could stir the pot a bit. I did want to say, Fergus, ASPI has an enormous number of fans and followers here in Washington, so it's very good to hear what you have to say. And Jake, I'm a new fan of yours, having kind of met you recently, and thank you very much for having the courage to ask the fundamental questions and the strategic imagination to see it through. There's a lot to be learned from your presentation. It was quite comprehensive. I think it was 18 years ago when I was privy to the first policy debate in Washington, my first policy debate, over the question of whether the US should try to figure out how to penetrate the Chinese firewall. And there was all sorts of hand-wringing and yays and nays for and against it. Probably one of the more interesting arguments at the time was that, well, cyber tech and the Great Firewall, among other things, was at the time the equivalent of, say, automotive technology in the 1930s. And we just didn't have a good sense of how things were going to evolve. And so we just wanted to sit there and see how things were going to play themselves out. It's clear that the time for this discussion has come, and that advances have been made on both the offensive and the defensive side of cyber and ICT tech. And we don't have the luxury anymore, for reasons that Jake described, to not be asking this question. I do think that a proper defensive strategy for deterring PRC's many-faceted cyber offensive attacks on the United States and on our closest friends and allies in Asia and around the world will require a credible, a clear offensive strategy that shows very clearly what we're prepared to do in retaliation to PRC cyber espionage, to PRC manipulation of public opinion and information, and to make it clear to PRC that we want them to adjust their behaviors. I will also add that I believe, and I'd be interested to get the insights from a lot of the technology experts here, but PRC has succeeded in creating a fairly strong intranet. And through that, it is shaping public opinion internally in ways that fit the uses of the controlling regime. And we need to be asking ourselves, now that CCP's declared resumption on what it refers to as universal values is now almost 10 years old. Its declared resumption is now almost 10 years old. We need to be asking ourselves, well, what will China look like in another 10, 15, or 20 years, in which entire generation of Chinese will be brought up in a technologically sealed and molded environment, in which they are not exposed to alternative ideas, alternative ways of framing problems, other cultures, with the natural sympathies that do emerge between nations and that does happen, are not allowed to happen. I believe that in 10, 15, 20 years, we would be seeing a far larger problem than we have today when we look at PRC. And to show, I think, how deadly serious these things are, just look at, what public opinion in Russia looks like now. This is deadly serious. Sure, Vladimir Putin's gambits in Ukraine, his murderous behavior there has revealed glaring vulnerabilities in his regime and in his war machine. And yet people still believed that what they're doing in Ukraine was morally correct, that it was the right thing to be doing, that it was a historically justified thing to be doing. And there was no turning, it was very nigh impossible to deter that once a critical mass of people came to that view. I would also say, I think Jake's right that we need to start thinking about how to ratchet up pressures on the ruling regime, tensions, which reduce its ability to perform and to pursue certain strategic goals and certain kinds of behaviors. But I do think Fergus's comments on values is important. Why? Well, for one thing, I think the reason for Xi Jinping's ability to reconcentrate power into the party and into himself comes obviously less from Chinese communist ideology or even from love amongst the Chinese people for the Chinese communist regime, but rather through his ability to play both sides and to very, I think, skillfully use cultural conservatism and cultural nationalism in China, what we could broadly call a Confucian revival, if you will, to the CCP's advantage. They've used this to keep in check and to basically roll back some of the more liberalizing tendencies that began to emerge in the reform and opening up period. And also in the process, the CCP has become more and more, I would say, reliant on this cultural nationalism for its own power. The reason why I say this is partly because I think that this is a different beast that we're wrestling with now than a mere form of communist authoritarianism, and that the models that we use to conduct strategic campaigns against, say, the Soviet Union don't apply to this current competition, in part because I think that a lot of the cultural conservatives in China, even though they don't have any much love for the CCP, really would want to protect the regime if it came under threat and attack. And so I do think what we need to be doing, as Fergus suggested, is thinking about ways to build off of Confucian moral arguments and the natural sort of moral sympathies of Chinese culture. And frankly, that's going to require a heck of a lot more deep study in and out of government in the United States and beyond. Confucius very clearly taught that a regime that was repressive was in bad shape. But he didn't counsel that it was right and moral to overthrow that regime. I think Fergus's comments on Xinjiang, I think, are spot on. That whole debate, as we're well aware, anybody who looks at what's being said about Xinjiang in China either parrots the line that what CCP is doing there is benevolent and is doing good for the Uyghur and other Muslim minorities in that part of the country. And then, of course, the other line that we get is from the ultra-nationalists on the net, who are talking about how if the CCP doesn't get more repressive in Xinjiang, then the ultra-nationalists are going to bring greater pressure to bear on the CCP. So we need to enlarge that conversation strategically and let people understand what exactly their government is doing. Enabling that conversation and that connectivity amongst Chinese themselves, I think, is crucial. I think if we don't act now, as Jake advised, then it's going to be very, very difficult given advances in technology in the 5, 10, 15-year horizon, to physically penetrate that space. And so our window for opportunity, our window to move now in this minimal way, I think is closing fast. I'll stop there.
Okay. I noticed Frank Tedeschi had some comments, and because his boss sits on a cyber committee as the chair, I thought we would give him some opportunity to comment or ask a question, and then turn to Natalie Barnes, and we'll see if there are any more. If not, then that may be the evening. But I want to make sure that those two get their chance. Frank? Oh no. Frank, are you still there?
I'm here, Henry.
Okay, there we go.
Appreciate, this is a great conversation. Appreciate you inviting me to listen in. And I tell you, I'd love to have this as a hearing topic, overall hearing topic. The questions I asked, I think, in the chat room, I think suffice. Got a good response from the first one.
Could you just share that for the folks that didn't look at the chat room?
Okay. One of the questions that Senator Rounds usually asks witnesses in every hearing that we have is, are the American people being engaged enough? Do they understand the threat? Have we described the threat sufficiently? Having the American people decisively engaged is a powerful tool. It takes a lot to get their attention, and we bounced from, I mean, a 20-year war, and here we are with something else now. And I think we all work in national security in some way from different perspectives, but this is not what they do on a day-to-day basis. So have we gotten their attention sufficiently? Have we explained it in terms maybe less than deterrence theory that's understandable to the average American? Because the average American, when they understand, will help inform the debate, and when they're energized, they can do a lot of great things. So I appreciate the invitation. If anyone wants to expand on Jake's response to me on that question, or DOD doing economic war, I certainly would appreciate hearing your perspectives. Thank you.
Would either the speaker or the commentator wish to do that? And then we'll move to Natalie and perhaps meet our time limitation, arguably.
Okay, Sarah. So I'll just very briefly, because hopefully some other folks can chime in as well. I think you do hit the nail on the head. When you start engaging in broad, grand strategy, and that's really when you're talking about going after a competitor in the economic space, the diplomatic space, the political space, the military space, that requires close interagency coordination. And when it comes to the American people and the American system, we're not even talking about state and local government, and yet the Chinese have just penetrated state and local government to such a point that they actually rank American governors due for friendliness to the Chinese Communist Party. We have overt Chinese investment going on right now in North Dakota, which is a clear national security threat. And I think that when we start, and DOD tends to want to take this little myopic, this is my space only, and Commerce, Treasury, state governor, that's your problem. It takes significant political leadership and political leaders willing to expend political capital, because as you well know, most political leaders, you only have 2 or 3 big things that you can do at any one time. And I would humbly suggest to you that the American way of life is at stake. And that if we don't have a coordinated, bipartisan, across interagencies, across federal, state, and local government approach to include friends, partners, and allies hand in hand, we risk losing everything we gained after the Second World War. So I'll just stop there and let Ferguson pick it up. Over.
I'm not going to add on there. I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it with that, but I think that's good points.
Natalie, you have the last word. I think, if you're still there. Ms. Barnes?
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Hi, everyone. Just got the baby to bed. No, my question was just in the context of sort of broadly the offensive cyber work that Jake was talking about, how that sort of fits in with responsible state behavior. And I think the peacetime, wartime kind of dynamic is one I was also trying to dig into a little bit in the context of, there's obviously a threat, there's operations being conducted against the US and its allies, but does that sort of, constitute a certain threshold? I think Jake's point that a lot of this has happened without, particular kinetic or, other a lot of the influence campaigns and changes in our strategic decision making because of what we're facing in, say, the South China Sea and other has happened more through through certain activities that might not meet that threshold. So yeah, I guess it's the one that Fergus could probably talk to this better, because I know ASPI has done a lot on the norms and tried to sort of provide outreach in our region on sort of how we interpret those. But yeah, just how the offensive cyber fits within that, thinking about things like the misuse of ICTs from territory. And that also crosses with the Ukraine context, in which we have seen individual netizens conducting certain activities in wartime, against states, potentially against state infrastructure. And so, how do states sort of respond to that in the context of those norms that we're trying to uphold as well. So that was quite long-winded. Perhaps my written question was more succinct, but yeah, over to you, Jake and Fergus. Thanks.
I'll let Fergus take this one. Over.
Thanks, Jake. Look, I think it's a great question, and I think it was a little bit teed up with my overarching question around, comment around values. I think one of the distinguishing features of, the democracies is that we behave in a certain way, and sometimes we do tie our hands behind our backs if it's in the interests of doing things the right way rather than just because we can. So I think we have to think really carefully about the types of approaches that we take here. Equally, I think that we've had a real change in thinking as a result of Ukraine. And I think some of the, one of the big lessons from Ukraine is that we have to relearn deterrence, and we've forgotten how to use deterrence effectively. And because we were seen as a light touch and we wouldn't do anything, Putin decided that even though he was outmatched by NATO in Europe, that he could still have Ukraine. So I think we have to sort of be hard-nosed about it, but also respect our values. And I think there is a pathway that you could pursue that would square that circle.
Okay.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah,
Jake, do people,
sure.
I just sort of, in my written question, I did ask it, I noticed this was an objection you hadn't flagged. I mean, is this something you can comment on too, just in terms of informing us? I mean, we work in this space, and it's useful to have arguments from experts as to sort of how the offensive cyber work does, Australia's recently announced some work we're doing as well. It's just useful to to anticipate these types of objections, if you had any comments to share. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so I think that Ferguson's right. Obviously, you know, the overarching objective is not to make the liberal democracies more like China, right? You know, we certainly don't want that. But you raise a fair point, which is it responsible statecraft? Well, I could do like my two children often do when one is complaining about the other, which is, well, he did it first. You know, is it responsible statecraft for China to openly steal around $1 trillion a year of intellectual property around the world? They're the ones that have kind of set the terms of debate, and I think this is a problem early on when it comes to cyberspace, is that for decades, the United States operated under what I call a doctrine of restraint. In fact, it was specifically a doctrine of restraint. Our belief was that everyone assumed we had all of the power in the world to do anything we wanted in the cyber and information space. And if we did not do it, we showed restraint that would deter others from doing it because they obviously knew we could do it. And if we're not doing it, they shouldn't be doing it too. Well, we did not do those things. China did them anyway. So they kind of have set the conditions, the terms of the debate as it is. Now, I'm not saying that is it responsible statecraft for us to then go in and exploit fissures in the Chinese system to attack their ability to create a systemic control? Part of me wants to say, well, look at the alternatives. The alternatives are we end up in a war with China. I think that's something we all want to avoid. So would this perhaps preclude that if I give the Chinese Communist Party something else to worry about rather than making a play for Taiwan? I need them more concerned about the fact that they have a lot of social discontent over their COVID policies. Which is better? Ultimately, though, I would say, let's make sure that we understand that if we put the onus of the decision on the Chinese Communist Party, they're the ones who make the decision, not us. If if we're exacerbating social fissures that are already there, not unlike what other authoritarian regimes, Russia and China, exacerbate social fissures within our political system, undermine our own political legitimacy, then does that make it any less objectionable? I'm not all about anything goes. This is not the big Wild West, but as a naval officer, as somebody who, like my friends in the Australian Defence Forces too, you know, we're the ones that ultimately are looking at the SSN-13 slamming into the side of the hull and me going down to the bottom. So I would much prefer that we pursue policies at the national level that perhaps avoid getting into a direct kinetic conflict with these guys, and perhaps we can achieve our grand strategic objectives without the need to potentially get involved in a shooting war. So in a way, you know, is it a lesser of two evils? Perhaps. But me personally, you know, it's like there's not a lot of good choices. Your choices in foreign policy are bad, and worse. This may be, I say this is bad. It's probably not the worst choice. I'll leave it at that.
Well, on that upbeat note, I've talked with Brian about our next meeting. We have tentatively, I think we're focusing on what kind of space cooperation might be conducted with Japan. We're also going to take a look in due course with regard to space cooperation with South Korea. And we've lined up a speaker. We have a little more work to do, but that would occur, we believe, you know, in about a month, early June, and we will certainly keep everyone in tap. Finally, I just want to thank everyone for participating and the questions. Also the presentations, which I thought were first rate. And I hope that more reflection and communication amongst yourselves on these topics will ensue as a result of this meeting. I do not think we have talked anywhere near enough about this constellation of issues, and that unless we are willing to talk about it, and I have to say openly, it's going to be very hard for the system to work when it's closed. That's just my read at this point, and we need to risk doing the highest form of classified work. It's called thoughts only, and that can only occur in the open realm. So on that note, again, thank you for setting us off, and I hope to be in touch and see many of you again at our next meeting. Thank you.